Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Don't Risk It podcast presented by VFIS Client Risk Solutions. This program focuses on the exposures our clients frequently encounter and discusses the potential solutions to help reduce these exposures. I'm your host, Chris Rodgers with VFIS Client Risk Solutions, and today we're discussing best practices regarding patient handling in emergency services. Joining me on the program today are Mike Baker and Dave Bradley from Client Risk Solutions and Paul Bachtel from our claims department. They're here to provide some suggestions regarding your patient handling procedures. Mike, Dave, and Paul, I want to thank you all for joining me today, and it's a pleasure to have you on the program.
Thank you, Chris.
Thanks, Chris.
Thank you, Chris.
So, Mike, I'm going to start the line of questioning off with you. What percentage of the claims that VFIS experiences are associated with patient handling?
That's a good question, Chris. I dug in the system this morning, kind of looking up this number to kind of see where it's at, and it's right at 44% of the professional liability claims that we experience are going to be a result of patient handling, which is stretcher ops, stand-in pivots, moving patients to and from ambulances, all of those things. So it is a key component that leaders and responders should be aware of out in the industry.
So, Paul, you're here from the claims department. You get to look at a lot of those claims. Are there any trends that you see in this area?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. I think some of the biggest trends are unloading and loading of a patient in the back of an ambulance, and also moving a patient from home to ambulance or from ambulance to the hospital. Seem to be the majority of these type of patient handling claims are a result of that.
Can you describe any investigation findings from these events that you've encountered? Was there a lack of comprehensive orientation? Was it a training situation, maintenance, or all of the above? Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of different factors. Some of the key factors are communication between the two providers, not communicating. Another factor is the layout of the property and paying attention and having a good understanding of whether there's cracks or crevices or potholes that could affect the wheel. And ultimately, a big factor is not properly moving the patient, having both hands on the stretcher. Those are good trends with what we see.
So, Mike, Dave, can you kind of comment on what takeaways should be taken from these type of events?
Chris, one of the things I wanted to kind of throw out there is there's been some advancements in the last several years with some engineering controls. So there's power lifting systems now in these ambulances, which again assist with reducing some of the exposure, but it doesn't eliminate that. The other side being some of these units that are out there now are much heavier, and that leads to a whole nother issue of, how far can you take that stretcher with the weight of a patient and the equipment on it versus 5 or 10 years ago when the systems were a little bit lighter, and maybe you could have managed some of those lifts and some of those scenes that are away from the units. Dave, do you have anything to add to that?
I don't know if it's in the same alley, but you look at the risk factors associated with it, and there's Paul brought up several of them. Not staying in contact with the stretcher. Go back to basics, not using the right equipment. We have great equipment by manufacturers in this country that have spent a lot of R&D, and we tend to still use a household chair as a carrying device rather than using a stair chair. We still take the stretcher up steps or into a home when it really should be left outside and get the patient to that device. So it really comes back to situational awareness and really a good overview of what am I facing and how do I best accomplish this mission.
Yeah, Chris, one of those best practices, and Dave hit on it, is the stretchers on the stairs or the proper pieces of lifting equipment. A lot of times, Paul's probably seen it. Paul, tell me if you say I'm wrong here, but when you put the stretchers on those stairs, we're saying one elevation change. So street level to a curb to a sidewalk, one step up to a porch. But on many of the scenes that we have here, at least in the northeast part of the country, your stretcher is probably going to stop at the threshold of that house. Like, there's no sense in taking it any further because you're probably on a staircase or something that's going to be multiple elevation changes at that point, and you'll need a different piece of lifting equipment. So, Paul, am I right? I mean, you're probably seeing a lot of your drops are happening on things where it's going downstairs and so forth.
Yeah, I would agree. I agree, Mike, and I think it has a lot to do with the device you're using to move a patient.
So What about you? You talked about some of the innovation in EMS in this regard, but what about some of the old ways of securing patients? Often, or far too often, we see shoulder straps removed from cots. Can you go into that and how that impacts patient handling effectiveness?
Sure. And, luckily in the past 10, 15 years, most states have signed on as part of the licensure is that they do spot inspections to see if there's shoulder straps. But again, it comes back to we fall back to bad practices of not using all the straps that are provided by the manufacturer of that device. And, those shoulder straps specifically, a lot of ambulance crashes are intersection crashes. Without those shoulder straps, that patient tends to slide off the stretcher. When we drop them, their heads tend to hit the ground if the stretcher tips. Going back to simple things. So, just some of those considerations. And Paul, thoughts on those?
Yeah, straps are certainly important. Making sure you have all 5 straps on if they're there. And even dropping a stretcher, if the straps are on the shoulders, the head tends to move to move less. Without those shoulder straps, you could have a patient who ultimately strikes the ground after the stretcher drops or tips. So definitely use all straps if applicable.
I know from my experience, the reason that I usually hear is, well, it's for patient comfort. But as Dave alluded to, as those straps come loose, and if you go head first into the front of the cab, that's a little bit more uncomfortable than just having a couple of straps on over your shoulders to the hospital. So the manufacturers put them there for a reason, and so we don't want to take those off because we could be voiding some warranty, or we certainly are putting our patients at a greater risk of getting injured.
And, to add to that, Chris, we're not only putting our patients at greater risk, that patient comes off the stretcher, they're now a risk to us, along with all their equipment that's potentially loose. So securing everything with the right straps is super important.
So were there any events that you all have experienced from a claims perspective or from working in EMS that impacted the current practices regarding patient handling?
I worked with a organization that had a patient handling incident. And it's really interesting when you talk to them and they go through what they went through and how uncomfortable it was from proper training, right off the bat, initial training, using the equipment correctly, having the right policies in place, maintenance on their equipment. They were hit for a lot of these areas because they didn't train properly. They didn't do maintenance. They didn't do ongoing education. So it was a very painful lesson that they learned. And I'm sure Paul has several in his back pocket he can talk about.
Yeah, I think I think you don't realize you have a problem until there's a problem. So it's always great to have these resources that we offer to help you get ahead of that.
And one of the things that I even piggyback on both their comments here is I had an organization I work with that basically had multiple different stretcher types, models, manufacturers in their fleet. It was a pretty large organization, but the problem is the providers weren't necessarily familiar with all of them and how they function or perform throughout the day. So that just makes that exposure, that hazard of being more susceptible to an incident even better.
What about partner pairing? Does that have any impact? We could have some provider that's 6'6" and working with a 5'10" female, and that's obviously almost a significant amount of difference. How can you elaborate on that?
Not always possible, but certainly in circumstances where you have the ability to match like size and capability, that should certainly be something that you look at when you're trying to put a schedule together. To have providers that are equally matched or complement each other well for lifting and proper lifting.
So can you elaborate on some best practices that our providers should look into when, to address in regard to orientation, ongoing training, maintenance?
Absolutely, Chris. And this is one of the areas we have a lot of resources to assist organizations. Think about the things that get us in trouble and address those. So, initial and ongoing patient handling training. Do situational awareness. Do that with your crews during your annual competencies or things like that. You talked about crews. Know the crew's ability. What are they able to lift? Do they know proper body mechanics? And then use the equipment appropriately by manufacturer guidelines. We talked about stretchers. the resources that are available to you to make the lift safely, all kinds of things. One that you don't think of very often, because the stretcher comes out of the back of the ambulance and it's in the loading position. It's all the way up. Lowering that to waist level, and even lower for certain circumstances. A patient of size or a patient that's a little bit unruly, taking that all the way to the ground. It's a little bit more work for the EMS providers, but at the end of the day, you're making sure that that patient's going to be as safe as possible.
And I'll circle back on this to what I said in the beginning. I know it's tough sometimes to get a seasoned provider to come to the table and train on all those awareness points that Dave just went through. But the key part you have to understand is if you do that, you're eliminating 44% of the professional liability that responder faces. I think that's huge as a leader to make sure that your folks are protected as best they can be.
So most of what we've talked about today is concerned or focused on stretchers and patient handling in a stretcher capacity. How do those concepts move from the ambulance to a wheelchair van if we have a provider that offers those services?
Paul, is there a common thing that you're seeing with regard to wheelchair vans? Is it in the vans or is it outside the vans?
Yeah, it's primarily in the vans during transport, making sure you put all of the secure straps down. I think one of the keys is the waist strap. That's often missed because in a wheelchair, most of the time, the patients already have their own belt. So some of the providers tend to miss the belt that's in the vehicle across the waist. And we see a lot of sliding out as you hard brake or a turn. So there's definitely some exposure there when driving. When not moving, it's the loading and unloading.
Yeah, absolutely. And you find most of the time those patients loading and unloading don't have belts on?
So usually with the loading and unloading, its situation is either the lift's up and open and they're not secured, so they might slide out. Most of the time, it's not the straps in the loading and unloading. It's the ability of the individual provider taking that patient off or out of the vehicle where the situation occurs.
And, to add to Paul's comment and go right back to where we were with patient handling, it comes down to initial training, proper equipment, proper securement, and assuring that that person understands how to do the job.
So, Dave, you just brought up proper training and resources to use for training. What does VFIS have in that area that can help our clients out?
So, Chris, great question. And VFIS has resources and materials. We have risk communiques. We also have videos that are on USB that talk about properly securing a patient, how to do it appropriately. Same with patient handling. We have a video on safe patient handling. And
an instructor level course as well.
Absolutely.
Where we'll come out to get, to teach you how to teach our program. Well, gentlemen, it was a pleasure talking with you all today. I want to thank you for joining me, and a lot of great information. So thank you again for being here.
Thank you.
Thanks, Chris.
Thank you, Chris.
And I want to thank you for listening to the program and for your interest in VFIS safety resources. I want to thank our guests Paul Bachtel, Mike Baker, and Dave Bradley once again for their time and information. Please consider subscribing to our program to stay up to date on new content releases. Also, if you like what you've heard, please consider leaving a review below. For more information about the many resources available from VFIS, please visit VFIS.com. And to submit ideas for future discussions, please reach out by emailing VFIS Risk Control at VFIS.com. Thanks, everyone, and have a great day. The views, information, or opinions expressed during this program are solely those of the individuals involved and do not necessarily represent those of Gladfelter Insurance Group, VFIS, and its employees. Additionally, all views, information, or opinions expressed are provided for informational purposes only and should not be construed as legal advice on any subject matter.